I'm Jose Antonio Vargas. I'm the founder of Define American. It's a nonprofit media organization dedicated to telling the stories of immigrants and changing the cultural narrative around immigration. At Define American, we believe in the power of stories to humanize the very political and politicized issue of immigration. We work with writers, producers, and directors in Hollywood to portray immigrants in films and television shows like Grey's Anatomy, Roswell, Superstore, and many others. We also work with journalists and news organizations. When it comes to journalism, our work serves two functions: to monitor and, when appropriate, to challenge news media's coverage of this highly charged issue, especially now, and to serve as a resource to help news organizations do their job. For example, days after President Trump announced that he was ending DACA, which provides temporary relief from deportation for undocumented immigrants who were brought to this country as children, we worked with MSNBC's AM Joy to produce an hour-long program on DACA and its recipients. We are here to help, and we've been helping journalists and news organizations for the past few years. Our tentpole campaigns, Words Matter, Facts Matter, and Sources Matter, are resources for journalists. You can check them out on defineamerican.com. The study that Define American is releasing today, in collaboration with our amazing friends at the MIT Center for Civic Media, is yet another source, a very, very important resource. Let me actually provide some history here. So ONA, this conference, is actually a part of Define American's history. It was at ONA's conference in 2012, a year after I publicly outed myself as an undocumented immigrant in the New York Times Magazine, that I challenged news organizations, specifically the New York Times and the Associated Press, to stop using dehumanizing, denigrating language and calling people illegal. Let's be clear and factual about this, especially from someone like me, who's a journalist who happens to be undocumented. I myself am here illegally, without authorization from the US government, subject to detention and deportation at any time. But I, as a person, am not illegal because human beings cannot be illegal. Let me repeat this again, especially among journalists in this room. There is a distinction between immigrants themselves and the politically polarizing issue of immigration. The trouble is, when journalists write about this issue, they seem to blur the lines between the people and the issue. The following year, after coming here in 2012, the Associated Press changed its style book and announced that it was no longer using the term illegal immigrant in news stories. The style book no longer sanctions the term illegal immigrant or the use of illegal to describe a person, announced the Associated Press. Instead, it tells users that illegal should only describe an action. Since then, since 2013, a large number of news organizations has signed on Define American's Words Matter pledge, and they include CNN, NPR, ABC News, and NBC News. I'm really proud to say at Define American we actually have over 60 college chapters across the country, and a lot of these college chapters work with student newspapers to sign on our Words Matter campaign. Then came the 2016 presidential campaign and the start of the Trump administration. By 2018, Define America noticed that not only were major news organizations using dehumanizing, denigrating language at an alarming rate, publications were also quoting extremist organizations without proper context. But we only had anecdotal data. We were using LexisNexis, like a lot of journalists. We were using Google Analytics. And as far as we know, there's been little to no study that we can think of that studies sources cited and language used when referring to immigrants and immigration. So thanks to our supporters at the MacArthur Foundation, who connected us to Ethan Zuckerman and the Center for Civic Media, we now have such a study. And we are releasing it here today at ONA for the first time. Words do matter. At a time when shooters at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the Garlic Festival in Gilroy, and the Walmart in El Paso all echoed similar words around invasion, we must have an honest conversation about the language we use in journalism. We must hold our journalistic values close, and we must forge a better path forward. So in our panel today, we have Ethan Zuckerman and Peter Pearl. Ethan, let me just, a brief bio. Ethan Zuckerman is the director of the Center for Civic Media at MIT and an associate professor of the practice at MIT Media Lab. His research focuses on the use of media as a tool for social change, the role of technology in international development, and the use of new media technologies by activists. He's the author of Rewire, Digital Cosmopolitans in the Age of Connection. You should buy it, I have it, it's great. Peter Pearl is a former Washington Post assistant managing editor. He has over 40 years of experience as a reporter and editor. I don't want to age you, Peter, but he was hired at the Washington Post in 1981, the year I was born. He is a Define American board member, a freelance editor, and executive coach. The Poynter Institute called Peter easily one of the most courtly and genial people ever to work in journalism, and I can attest to that. They went on to note that among his many achievements, as the Post's standard honcho, he undertook an initiative to help readers into the newsroom for critiques, which I think is something that most news organizations should follow across the country. So let me hand this over to Ethan.
Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here. So this is a moment where there are real and legitimate concerns about dangerous speech in public life and also sort of coming into the newsroom. And I'm using the term dangerous speech advisedly and consciously. This is a term my dear friend Susan Benesch has been really studying and trying to rigorously define. And for her, dangerous speech is speech that might move people to take violent action, very much like the violent actions that Jose was just talking about in El Paso and in other places. And so dangerous speech tends to combine two factors. One is the idea of dehumanizing speech, turning people into objects, into animals, into insects, which tends to be a precursor to violence, and then also ways in which you are calling people to violent action. So this work, for me as a scholar working on this, is sort of mobilized around the definitions that someone like Susan is putting forward. And let me start by also saying that I just want to acknowledge that this is a manel. We don't do manels. Susan was supposed to be here, but has a beautiful 6-week-old baby daughter, Aya, and so for obvious reasons isn't traveling. The other person who's supposed to be here is Emily Endalue, who actually did the work on this for the Media Cloud team. She has a 5-week-old baby daughter named Chinyelu. So these two utterly badass mom researchers should be up here on stage instead of me, and I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge the work that they've done on this. So here's the data that we ended up using to sort of work our way through this. I'm part of a team that has put together this tool called Media Cloud. And Media Cloud is a tool that we've been working on for 12 years now. It's basically LexisNexis redesigned to let you count words in stories. And the idea behind that is if you ask yourself a question like, hey, is the term illegal alien increasing or decreasing in media? That's an incredibly hard question to answer in a scientific and rigorous fashion. And so about 12 years ago, colleagues of mine over at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard and over at Center for Civic Media got together, and we have worked for 12 years now to build an open source and free, both as in speech and as in beer, tool that you can use to ask quantitative questions about media attention. And what Media Cloud does is it brings in every day 59,000 news sources. So that's not just the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's the website of KSAT in San Antonio. It's a very wide range of sources. It also includes big collections of left-wing and right-wing blogs. It is a huge collection at this point, and like I said, it's free to use. You can come in, you can run searches on it. It's made possible by an incredible set of people In this case, we really want to shout out the MacArthur Foundation and Jen Humke in particular, who has brought together a bunch of activism and advocacy organizations and asked them to really take a quantifiable look at what the work that they're doing is having impact, and we've been trying to lend a hand with that. So what people do with Media Cloud is they try to ask this question of what's in the news? What are we paying attention to? What topics get covered and what doesn't get covered? We ask questions about what's the language that's getting used. If we're talking about immigration, what's the language we use to talk about it? Who do we talk about when we talk about this? Do we just talk about elites? Do we quote people on the street? And then ultimately, what stories are influential in this? What ones get shared in social media? What ends up setting the terms of the dialogue as it gets picked up in other sorts of conversations? So people come to us when they're trying to do what Jose was talking about, to get from anecdote to data. So our friends at Define American, anecdotally, were seeing the return of the I word, right? They were seeing forms of dehumanizing speech come back into media, and they wanted to know quantifiably what was sort of coming out of that. First of all, they wanted to know, is this only happening on the far right? And so rather than look just at the far right, we actually centered our work on 4 outlets that have a pretty good geographic reach, might be thought of as some of the most representative and sort of influential outlets within the US press. In addition to looking at these 4, we also looked at some very large collections of media. We keep a far right, a center right, a centrist, a center left, and a left-wing collection, and we analyzed these vis-a-vis those. And what we did is starting to understand just where immigration is as far as an issue in the media. And one of the things that we've seen in a bunch of our work lately is that the conversation about immigration has gotten much, much louder and much, much more present starting in the run-up to the 2016 election campaign. My colleague Yochai Benkler has released a terrific book called Network Propaganda, which basically pulls apart the 2016 US election from the perspective of media. So if you were reading that election as a media studies scholar, one of the big stories of that election is that Donald Trump brought immigration into the Republican Party as an issue. If you think about it, immigration in the long run is a losing issue for Republicans. The United States is changing. We're becoming a much more diverse, much more colorful nation. The Republican Party had moved away from migration as one of their central planks until Trump dragged it back in. And so his book really looks at how Trump brought immigration into the media narrative, how media followed along, and since Trump has been in office, we've seen a huge, huge focus on immigration. We've also seen the rise in this set of terms. This is a set of terms that we put together with Define American, also with Susan Benesch at the Dangerous Speech Project, to sort of understand what these denigrating terms might look like. And then we went ahead and started looking for these through those 4 news sources and through media as a whole between 2014 and 2018. You're very, very welcome to photograph these slides. I guarantee you an even better version of this is in the report, which is online, and do you, but you can grab it that way as well. So here's what we found when we tried to sort of put data on rigorous anecdote. The answer is, in these 4 major publications, we saw big, big rises in immigration coverage. That's the light blue bar. Those are all quite substantial changes in immigration coverage. The LA Times has significantly more coverage between 2014 and 2018. You then also have in the dark blue bar a rise in this denigrating language. And what's happening there is you can see in absolute terms, we are simply seeing these terms more often than we were seeing them in 2014. Day to day, reading the newspaper, you're simply going to come across these terms more often than you used to. Here is the interesting bit of it. They're actually a smaller percentage of the immigration stories. So what's actually happening here is we have much, much more immigration coverage in the newspaper. When you grab an immigration story at random, there's actually a slight decline in how often these terms are used. But there's so much more immigration coverage that overall, in the course of any news day, these denigrating terms are appearing significantly more often. And it is that overall trend that we are really concerned with. From the media research side of this, here's the really fascinating bit. When these terms make it into the newspaper, they are far more often than in 2014 showing up in quotes. And here's the way that I end up sort of understanding that. We have public figures out there using this denigrating language routinely. There are three ways that you can respond to this language. You can either pick it up and add it to your style guide. Hey, Trump says illegals, now our newspaper is going to say illegals. That's one way to do it. You can look at it and say, Donald Trump said illegals, right? And you're using the term, but you're distancing yourself from it. You're putting it in Trump's mouth, which is where it came from. You can also say so-called illegals, and you're using it within your story, but you're not taking ownership from it. You're distancing yourself from it. And you can simply decide not to use the term. You can simply not include it in the newspaper, and you can choose a different quote associated with it. And you can see ways in which this sort of ends up getting used differently. And as I said, we see a substantial rise in these terms coming into those four news organizations. We also see a substantial rise from the far left to the far right in how these terms are being used. We also see them being quite different from one news organization to another. So the Washington Post, unfortunately, uses these terms quite a bit more often than its peers. And part of what we're trying to figure out is, why might this be? It may be that being focused on Washington discourse, where these terms are increasingly common, it's simply showing up more often for them. What's interesting, though, is the LA Times, which is there in red. The LA Times saw this creeping up. You could see them using these terms a little bit more, and they clearly made a newsroom judgment that they didn't want to be using these terms. And they made the judgment that they weren't going to use them in quotes, out of quotes. They just simply weren't going to use them. And for me, this is the real message of this study that we're putting out. You have a choice in a newsroom about what you want to do with language. And I don't want to tell you how to use language. My job is not, to order you to be one way or another. It's actually to count words. And so what I actually want you to do is to count your words. And that's why I've been trying to build this tool and this style of research, is to help people count what they're saying and ask those questions about what the implications are associated with it. But in terms of other things that we counted, I'm going to hand it back to Jose.
Thank you, Ethan. So at Define American, we have the Words Matter campaign, but we have a Facts Matter campaign, and facts that we think too often don't make it in the way news organizations, including those four news organizations, cite undocumented immigrants. So again, I'm a journalist kind of in my DNA, right? So a little example of this. So according to the Social Security Administration, a primary source, undocumented immigrants have contributed about $100 billion to the Social Security Fund in the past decade. $100 billion. According to actually one of the heads of the Social Security Administration, undocumented immigrants using invalid Social Security numbers have helped keep Social Security solvent. How often do you hear about this? I did my own little research because I'm curious if that is a statistic and a report or an actual number that's been cited by any one of these four news organizations that we mentioned. Barely makes it. So when we talk about the issue, we surrender to the narrative that these quote-unquote illegal immigrants, which is still the language that the New York Times and the Washington Post continue to use every day, right, don't contribute anything to the economy. So our work is also about sourcing. Sources matter. That was one of the earliest things I learned as a journalist when I was a teenager. Who you source in a news story matters. And when it comes to this issue, There's been three leading organizations that when you're a journalist and you're looking for this thing called balance, and an editor says you need the other side, we go to three. A lot of news organizations, a lot of reporters in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and USA Today go to three. They go to Numbers USA, Federation for Immigration Reform, and Center for Immigration Studies. You can find information about these sources on our website. And these three organizations play a really outsized and overwhelmingly unchecked role in news stories. Meaning when they are quoted, a lot of journalists don't actually point to their extremist views. Usually you hear people saying, oh, this organization which seeks to limit immigration, right? And I don't know if you can read some of these quotes up here. One of the leaders for the Center for Immigration Studies says that Haiti's so screwed up because it wasn't colonized long enough. The head of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, FAIR, has said publicly that immigrants are getting into competitive breeding. And the man, John Tanton, who actually helped found and fund these three organizations, has said, can the minorities who are going to inherit California run an advanced society? Clearly, these are not neutral sources of information. And yet, when news organizations cite these sources, we treat them like they're neutral. Or worse, we as journalists do not provide enough context as to where their perspective and their point of view is coming from. And that is where we are failing. And if the major news organizations are doing it, I can only imagine what regional local organizations feel like they have to do, right? And so for us at Define American, it's very, very important, right, that we help determine how we source information and how we contextualize what this issue is. And here's another really big problem, right? When I was a political reporter at the Washington Post, whenever I would quote CAP, the Center for American Progress, I always have to say, comma, a think tank with ties to the Democratic Party. Or when I would quote the Heritage Foundation, comma, a conservative group with ties to the Republican Party. When these three organizations are quoted, right, not only are we not appropriately describing what their views are, there's actually a direct correlation between these organizations and people serving in the Trump administration. There's a pipeline, right? So for example, Julie Kritchner was the executive director at FAIR from 2007 to 2015. Since May 2017, she has served as the Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman within the Department of Homeland Security. So these extremist views are actually help run these agencies. A woman named Kellyanne Conway, I'm sure you've seen her on television. Since the 1990s, she's been not only counselor to Trump, but she has provided polling for these three organizations. And those are just two examples. So there's an entire pipeline that we as journalists are not even really recognizing in the way we report this issue. So our ask at Define American is that you use our resources, words matter, facts matter, and sources matter, and that you do the kind of soul searching that needs to happen in newsrooms as to what kind of sources you need to use to more accurately and more fairly report on the issue. Now I'm going to bring Peter Pearl to talk to us about what this means for newsrooms.
Hello. At the Washington Post during the years I worked there, one of the things that becomes clear is that major news organizations do not have a real strength in being self-critical. But with the internet era, they come to understand that they cannot really be the quote-unquote gatekeepers and sort of dictate how language is used and how stories are sourced. I think that this study, do you have the slide, Christian?
Oh, sorry, thanks.
Oh, okay. Very good. I think the message here is, you know, the media cloud people have given the news media here a really invaluable tool. When we were involved in considering changes to the style book at the Washington Post, it was really working in a vacuum, and it ended up to be a bunch of people sitting around and talking about usage, copy editors, reporters, and top editors, just kind of brainstorming and what they had heard personally. So this is a real opportunity for journalists to focus on themselves and what they're doing in terms of word choices, and in the countless decisions that you make on stories, also who you choose to quote. Another thing that's important is that these decisions should not be left just to the senior people in management, but people who are reporting every day, who are out there talking to the quote-unquote real people, and who have firsthand experience with these issues, should also be part of this discussion. And every time that you are quoting somebody, thinking about calling a human being illegal should be part of the equation of how we are committing journalism. The sources matter. The sources matter aspect is also really significant. I get pretty steamed when I see some of these organizations quoted without any kind of description or attribution. And if you really do your homework and look at the origins of the three organizations that Jose mentioned, these started out as organizations that appeared to be mainstream and wanted to reform immigration. And initially they had mainstream people. I remember reading about Warren Buffett and Eugene McCarthy back in the day of their founding, supporting these organizations. And they quickly dropped out when they saw the direction in which the organizations were going. And now this is the realm of people like Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who is affiliated with these groups. And I just think that that's a particular responsibility of journalists, is you want to give your readers as good a shot as possible for them to really understand what is the nature of this debate. I also have to say, as a Jewish person, I'm a little sensitive to the particular choices of words, and words like alien and talking about invasions and things like that really hit close to home. So I would just like to encourage you in your own organizations to realize that you have a lot of influence in your own personal choices as journalists, in terms of how you practice the craft, but also in influencing your organizations. And I would also encourage you to use the Media Cloud tool and to try to work on self-awareness and self-analysis as much as you can. And we'll be happy to take questions if we're opening the floor now.
I actually just have a couple of questions for our panel, and then we're gonna take your questions. So I feel like we just threw a lot at you, right? And so Ethan, starting with you, how can journalists actually use this data to proactively address some of the questions we've raised here?
How do we do this?
Do we push?
Push. We
There you
do.
go. Is it on? Yeah, mine's
Yeah.
on. Is yours on?
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, yours is on.
Could
Okay.
be. Excellent. So if you sign up for the tool, which is free, MediaCloud.org, what it lets you do is basically say, here's a term, here's a time period, here's a source or sources, and you'll get a histogram of how often that word comes out. And that's the simplest way to use the tool. There are a lot of other ways to do it. But the most straightforward way to do this is to sort of say, okay, is my news outlet using the term illegal immigrant or one of these other denigrating terms? We're actually putting up instructions on the website for how to check your news organization on this and essentially check yourself. The way that I would recommend doing it is it's great to look for illegal immigrant or illegal migrant as a phrase. We're going to put up that whole complex set of terms that we used in it. The other thing to do is actually just to check against migration as a whole, right? Because one of the things that we're finding is that even news outlets that are using these denigrating terms less often percentage-wise, because migration has become such a topic, you're simply encountering these terms more often. The next thing that Media Cloud does is it gives you examples of where this is showing up within that corpus, right? So I'm just tracking the conversation on Twitter because I'm like that. And people are sort of saying, well, isn't this just a consequence of President Trump tweeting? And the answer, yeah, in part, but that's where you want to monitor yourself, right?
Yep.
So if you're looking at this and essentially saying, yep, we're using these terms more often, but again and again, it is Trump tweeted blank, 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 that might be very different than, for instance, actually my reporters seem to be starting to use this term or put it into quotes. And so what I'm asking more than anything else is, look, anyone who's worked in a newsroom knows that words matter. Everybody who's worked in a newsroom knows that we have to kind of check ourselves periodically as far as what we're saying. Doing it systemically, doing it looking at the last 5 years, doing this as relative to your peers, these are all things that you can do by using an automated tool to do it. And it ends up giving you a lot more perspective on what your newsroom is doing well or poorly in this form of coverage.
Thank you, Ethan. Peter, I just have to ask you this. So if you were an editor at the Washington Post today, and I'm sad to report as a former Washington Post reporter that the Washington Post is really bad when it comes to this, how would you use the contents of this report if you were working in that newsroom now?
I think having discussion and self-reflection is really important. You know, it's hard with the president. I mean, quoting the president with the exact language is something that will really always be done, and that can't be avoided and shouldn't be. But there's a lot of circumstances in which you could, if you're using a direct quote, maybe put ellipsis and put, you know, undocumented, not repeat illegal alien or illegal immigrant unnecessarily. And I think it's a process. I mean, in some ways, this parallels racially charged language where there previously were words that didn't really get people thinking, and now you would never think of, you know, colored or Negro or whatever. And so hopefully this just begins a process of sensitizing both in people's individual work themselves and their choices, but also having organizations, you know, focus on it.
And you kind of brought this up, Peter. Let me follow up on this. Like, so if you're a reporter, and we know how bureaucratic and hierarchical newsrooms are. So if you're like a young reporter or a reporter of any age, and you have to report to 3 other editors to bring up something like this, how would you advise them to do it? To bring up the fact, hey, our newsroom is doing this. So how do they do that in a way that is, because you know how sometimes journalists can be worried that, hey, if I do this, would I be reprimanded? Am I speaking out too much? How would you recommend they do that?
Smart reporters kind of know how to navigate bureaucracies, and finding, first of all, you know, institutional change is difficult, but, you know, finding your most likely allies and having these conversations in a constructive way. I mean, many editors get into the sort of defensive crouch, but, you know, a well-reasoned argument, and particularly when you can say, well, you know, these other news organizations are getting higher marks than we are, and we're kind of looking a little funky here. You know, you use the same kind of finesse that you would in doing a story. you learn who to talk to and how to talk to them.
And navigate that.
Yeah.
But hopefully the message is you do have I hope you feel a responsibility to speak up and figure out a way to do that in a way that's constructive and the way that's helpful. So the last question before I take it to the audience is, so what's next? Like, what else can we do? After this report, how else are we going to move this forward?
So I'm a geeky media theorist, so I'm going to answer that almost in a technical way rather than sort of an activist way. And honestly, like, that's the partnership here, right? Like, so my job is to rigorously count words, document my methodology, tell you where I'm screwing up on it, and improve my methodology. Figuring out what that means is the admirable gentleman to either of my sides. So here are the methodological things I want to do on this. The biggest thing we figured out in this is that quotation marks are important, right? We generally treat the media as a big bag of words. And we're really interested in seeing, oh, this phrase, illegal alien, is appearing more often. But it matters enormously if that's appearing in quotes, not in quotes. It matters if the quotes are scare quotes in the text or whether they're quotes from a specific journalist. You're going to have to trust me on this. That problem computationally, figuring out whether it's a quote attributed to someone or whether it's being used in the text, computationally hard. And we're now working on trying to fix it. Second one, this is going to freak the hell out of people once you think about it. We don't have a very good way computationally of telling whether a story is an editorial or an op-ed, or whether it's news reporting. And here's the thing, I'm going to argue it just doesn't matter that much these days. These stories are not read in the context of picking up the newspaper and flipping through that. You hit them on Twitter or on Facebook, and you often aren't getting that context of this is an editorial, this is an opinion piece. You're simply getting the brand association and the term. But we want to have much better sensitivity about how we deal with that in our data set. Third thing, this was a study of 4 elite newspapers, and when you dig into the study, it's those elite newspapers vis-a-vis a couple thousand blogs, newspapers, televisions that have websites, so on and so forth. We need much better tools for studying language on local TV news, which continues to be the most important source of information for many people out there. We need much better tools for studying talk radio, which is incredibly important, particularly on the right. We also need better tools, and we're building these, around things like Reddit, which people tend not to take seriously, but it's a huge, huge, huge community, and probably not a bad proxy for asking this question, is public language changing, right? This is a study about journalistic language, what's happening to language as a whole. So I'm happy to geek out with any of you here on what we're doing to add in those different corpora. You can tell that I'm a computer scientist because I use words like corpora with a straight face. But that's sort of where we're going on it from the computational and analytics side.
Peter?
Well, I'm going to cop out and say that I'm happily retired now, and I don't have to deal with these issues. But I just think that people who want to practice the best journalism possible use the best words possible that don't offend and dehumanize people, and also do their best job in presenting readers with a real understanding of who's really talking when I'm quoting these people, who are they really? So to the extent you do this as individual journalists or as people who try to make your organizations better, the goal is quality journalism, and obviously now more than ever, it's a real responsibility to do this, because it's being done less and less all the time, and the people who are serious about doing it really have an obligation to do the best job possible.
Yes, absolutely. And just know that please go to the 2 websites there just to get more, all the information you want. For us, again, our goal here is how do we help you do the job that you have to do. So, okay, so now we'll take questions. Is there like a mic, or people just get up? People just get up. I'm going to start with Daniela. What's up? Can you, yeah, just get up.
Thanks, this is fascinating. I run a newsletter called Migratory Notes, which covers immigration issues, and we synthesize weekly coverage. One question, so I think I misunderstood. four major sources for the study?
Sort of. So the study, in some ways, we're sort of simplifying like a 25-page study here. So we mostly talked about those four major sources. We also compared against 5 collections of sources. These are collections that we built in 2016. We built them by basically trying to figure out what media is most often cited by the far right, the center left, far left. We did that by looking at what politicians people cite on Twitter, and then if you're citing left politicians, what other news are you citing? If you're citing right politicians, what other, and there's a whole paper about why that's a legitimate method. So we've got 5 collections, and we checked this work against those collections as well. And what's kind of interesting is Washington Post kind of tracks center right in this, and everybody else tracks sort of center to center left in this.
Do you think Washington Post is because they're doing the most government coverage?
Is it the Washington Post?